Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them. Picture this. Thousands of tourists gathered outside a royal palace, cameras ready, expecting nothing more than a glimpse of tradition and ceremony. What they witnessed instead was something that would restore their faith in humanity and remind them that behind every uniform beats a human heart. In a world where viral videos often showcase the worst of humanity, this story stands as a beacon of hope. It's about a single moment of compassion that rippled across the globe, touching millions of hearts and proving that kindness knows no boundaries, not even the rigid protocols of royal duty. This is the true story of how one royal guard's split-second decision to choose humanity over duty created a moment so pure, so genuine, that it reminded everyone watching what it truly means to be human. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 1,000th time in his 15-year career. The familiar weight of his bearskin hat settled comfortably on his head, and the polished buttons on his uniform gleamed in the early light. For James, this wasn't just another day at work. It was another opportunity to serve his country with the same dedication that had driven him since he first enlisted at 18. James came from a long line of military men. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in the Falklands, and now James carried on the family tradition as a member of the Queen's Guard. Growing up in a small town in Yorkshire, James had always dreamed of wearing the iconic red uniform. His childhood bedroom walls were covered with pictures of guards standing stoically outside royal residences, their faces hidden beneath the shadow of their tall black hats. The path to becoming a Queen's Guard hadn't been easy. James spent years in the British Army, serving 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for ceremonial duties. The training was rigorous, not just physically, but mentally. Guards were expected to maintain absolute composure regardless of what happened around them. They were living statues, symbols of British tradition and military excellence. James remembered his first day on duty vividly. He had been so nervous that his hands shook as he took his position outside St. James's Palace. The training instructor's words echoed in his mind. "You are not James Mitchell when you put on that uniform. You are the embodiment of centuries of British military tradition. You do not move, you do not speak, you do not react. You are a guardian of history itself." Over the years, James had stood motionless through rain, snow, and blazing summer heat. He had endured tourists trying to make him laugh, children pulling funny faces, and countless attempts to get a reaction from him. He had witnessed marriage proposals, family reunions, and even a few medical emergencies, all while maintaining his stoic demeanor. It was a source of pride for him, the ability to separate his personal feelings from his professional duty. But James was more than just a soldier. Behind the stern facade was a man who had grown up helping his mother care for his younger sister, Emma, who had been born with Down syndrome. Emma was the light of James's life, and her innocent joy and unconditional love had shaped him into the compassionate man he was today. She was now 28 and lived in a supported living facility, but James visited her every weekend without fail. Emma had taught James that the world could be a challenging place for those who were different. She had faced stares, whispers, and sometimes outright cruelty from people who didn't understand her condition. James had spent countless hours as a child defending his sister, explaining to classmates that she was just like them in all the ways that mattered. These experiences had instilled in him a deep sensitivity to the struggles of vulnerable people, though this side of his personality rarely showed during his professional duties. The ceremonial role of the Queen's Guard was steeped in history dating back to 1660. The guards were responsible for protecting the royal family and royal residences, but their duties had evolved over time to include a significant ceremonial component. Tourists from around the world came specifically to see the guards in their traditional uniforms, to witness the changing of the guard ceremony, and to try to get a reaction from these human statues. For the guards themselves, the role required immense discipline. They stood for hours without moving, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead. They were trained to ignore distractions, to remain focused on their duty regardless of what was happening around them. Any breach of protocol could result in disciplinary action or even dismissal from the unit. James had always excelled at this aspect of the job. His colleagues often joked that he was made of stone, so perfect was his ability to remain motionless and impassive. He took pride in this reputation and worked hard to maintain it. In his mind, he was representing not just himself or even the British Army, but the entire nation. Every tourist who saw him standing guard was forming an impression of British military discipline and professionalism. The relationship between the guards and the public was complex. While tourists were generally respectful, there were always those who saw the guards as entertainment rather than working soldiers. James had endured people jumping up and down in front of him, shouting, making loud noises, and even occasionally touching him or his uniform. The guards were trained to handle such situations with minimal response, a stern warning, or, in extreme cases, a formal report to the police. Despite the challenges, James genuinely enjoyed his role. There was something deeply satisfying about being part of such an ancient tradition, about knowing that he was following in the footsteps of thousands of soldiers who had stood in the same positions over the centuries. He felt connected to history in a way that few people ever experience. The tourists, too, played an important role in the daily life of the guards. While they could sometimes be disruptive, James had come to appreciate their enthusiasm and curiosity. Many had traveled thousands of miles just to see the guards in person, and he understood that for many visitors, seeing the Queen's Guard was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Children, in particular, seemed fascinated by the guards, often staring in wonder at their tall hats and colorful uniforms. James had developed an ability to observe the crowds without appearing to do so. He could track movement, assess potential threats, and monitor the mood of the gathered tourists, all while maintaining his statue-like pose. Over the years, he had become adept at reading people, identifying the troublemakers, spotting the families with excited children, and recognizing the tourists who were genuinely moved by the ceremony and tradition they were witnessing. The guards worked in shifts, typically standing for 2 hours before being relieved. During these periods, James would often find his mind wandering to his life outside the palace walls. He thought about Emma, about his girlfriend Sarah whom he hoped to marry soon, about his plans for after his military service ended. But he never allowed these personal thoughts to affect his professional demeanor. Training for the Queen's Guard involved much more than learning to stand still. The guards had to master complex drill movements, maintain their equipment to exacting standards, and learn the intricate protocols that governed royal ceremonial events. They studied the history of their regiment, memorized the layout of the royal residences, and practiced responding to various emergency scenarios. Physical fitness was crucial. The guards' uniforms were heavy. The bearskin hat alone weighed nearly 2 pounds, and the full ceremonial dress added significant weight. Standing motionless for hours required strong leg muscles and excellent posture. The guards trained regularly to maintain their physical conditioning and practiced their ceremonial duties until every movement was automatic. Mental preparation was equally important. The guards learned techniques for maintaining focus during long periods of duty, methods for dealing with fatigue and discomfort, and strategies for remaining alert while appearing relaxed. They were taught to view their role as a form of meditation, a way of achieving complete presence and awareness while maintaining perfect external stillness. James had always been naturally good at this mental discipline, but it had taken years to perfect. Early in his career, he would sometimes find his mind racing with random thoughts, making it difficult to maintain the required level of focus. Over time, he developed his own techniques for staying centered and alert during long shifts. The relationship between the guards and their officers was built on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. The officers understood the challenges of ceremonial duty and worked to ensure that their soldiers were properly prepared and supported. Regular debriefings after each shift allowed guards to discuss any issues or concerns, and ongoing training helped maintain the high standards expected of the unit. James had earned the respect of his colleagues and superiors through his dedication and reliability. He was often chosen for high-profile events and had stood guard during visits by foreign dignitaries and members of other royal families. His service record was exemplary, with numerous commendations for his professionalism and attention to detail. But beneath the perfect soldier exterior, James remained the same caring brother who had spent his childhood looking out for Emma. He carried with him the lessons she had taught him about kindness, acceptance, and the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances. These values sometimes created an internal tension with the demands of his professional role, but James had always managed to keep his personal feelings separate from his duties. As he took his position that morning, James had no idea that the day ahead would test everything he believed about duty, protocol, and the true meaning of service. The tourists were already beginning to gather, cameras at the ready, expecting to see the same unchanging display of military precision they had come to witness. None of them, including James himself, could have imagined that they were about to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the stoic guards of the British royal family. By mid-morning, the area around Buckingham Palace had transformed into a sea of tourists, each hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous changing of the guard ceremony. The crowd was unusually large for a Tuesday in October, swelled by several tour groups and a cruise ship that had docked in Southampton the previous evening. James stood at his post near the palace gates, his trained eyes scanning the crowd, even as his face remained completely expressionless. The composition of the crowd was typical for this time of year. There were elderly couples clutching guidebooks and wearing comfortable walking shoes, their faces bright with the excitement of fulfilling a lifelong dream to visit London. Young backpackers with cameras hanging around their necks jockeyed for the best positions to photograph the guards, while families with children struggled to keep their little ones entertained in the growing crowd. Among the gathering tourists was the Chun family from Singapore. David and Linda Chun had saved for 3 years to bring their family to Europe, and visiting Buckingham Palace was at the top of their 10-year-old son Marcus's wish list. Marcus had been fascinated by the British royal family since watching a documentary about the Queen's Guard in his history class. He had spent weeks before the trip reading about the Guards' uniforms, their training, and their role in protecting the royal family. Marcus was not like other children his age. Born with autism, he experienced the world differently. Loud noises could overwhelm him, unexpected changes in routine could trigger anxiety attacks, and social situations that came naturally to other children often left him feeling confused and isolated. But Marcus also possessed an extraordinary memory and an intense capacity for focus when something captured his interest. The Queen's Guard had become his latest obsession. His parents had learned to navigate Marcus's unique needs with patience and understanding. They had carefully planned this trip, researching the best times to visit popular attractions, identifying quiet spaces where Marcus could retreat if he became overwhelmed, and preparing detailed schedules to help him feel secure. Linda carried a small bag with noise-canceling headphones, his favorite sensory toys, and a laminated card explaining his autism in case they needed help from strangers. The family had arrived at the palace early, hoping to secure a good viewing spot before the crowds became too dense. David held Marcus's hand firmly as they made their way through the gathering tourists, while Linda kept a protective arm around their 8-year-old daughter Sophie, who was more interested in the horses she hoped to see than in the guards themselves. As they found a spot along the palace railings, Marcus's excitement was visible to anyone who knew how to read the signs. While other children might have been running around or chattering excitedly, Marcus stood very still, his eyes fixed on the guards with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. He was memorizing every detail, the precise angle of their rifles, the way the morning light reflected off their buttons, the exact positioning of their feet. "Look, Marcus," his father whispered, pointing toward James's position. "That's one of the Queen's Guards. Just like in the book we read." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving James's imposing figure. To Marcus, the guard represented everything he found comforting about the world: precision, predictability, and unchanging routine. The guard stood exactly as Marcus had read he would stand. His uniform was precisely as it had been described in his books, and his posture was perfectly straight and unwavering. The crowd around them continued to grow, and with it came the inevitable noise and commotion that accompanied large gatherings of tourists. People chatted loudly in multiple languages, children called out to their parents, and tour guides spoke through small megaphones to address their groups. The cacophony of sounds began to create the kind of sensory overload that Marcus's parents had hoped to avoid. Linda noticed the signs first: the way Marcus's breathing became shallow, how his hands began to flutter slightly at his sides, the tension that crept into his small shoulders. These were the early warning signs that Marcus was becoming overwhelmed, signals his parents had learned to recognize over years of careful observation. "Maybe we should move to a quieter spot," Linda suggested quietly to her husband, but Marcus shook his head vigorously. He didn't want to leave. The guard, James, had become his anchor in the chaos around him. As long as he could focus on that still, unchanging figure, he could manage the overwhelming sensory input from the crowd. Meanwhile, other families were having their own experiences with the gathering crowd. An elderly woman named Dorothy from Wales had traveled to London with her adult daughter to fulfill a promise she had made to her late husband. They had planned this trip together for their 50th wedding anniversary, but Harold had passed away just 2 months before their planned departure. Dorothy had decided to make the trip anyway, carrying Harold's ashes in a small urn in her handbag, determined to see all the places they had dreamed of visiting together. Standing near the Chun family was a group of teenagers from a local school who were on an educational trip. Their teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was trying to maintain order and ensure her students were paying attention to the historical significance of what they were witnessing, rather than just treating it as an opportunity for selfies and social media posts. The tour groups added another layer of complexity to the crowd dynamics. Several guides were simultaneously providing commentary in different languages, creating a constant stream of information and background noise. Some tourists were more respectful than others. While many maintained an appropriate distance and spoke in hushed tones, others treated the guards as entertainment, making jokes and attempting to get reactions. James was acutely aware of the crowd's energy, even as he maintained his stoic pose. Years of experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated how the crowd was feeling and behaving. He could sense the excitement of the children, the reverence of the elderly visitors, and the sometimes inappropriate behavior of those who didn't fully understand the solemnity of his role. The morning sun climbed higher, and the October air began to warm slightly, though the stone courtyard remained cool. James could feel the weight of his uniform and the slight discomfort that came with standing motionless for extended periods, but these physical sensations were so familiar that he barely registered them consciously. His training had taught him to acknowledge discomfort without allowing it to affect his performance. As the crowd continued to grow, the dynamics between different groups became more complex. Patient tourists found themselves pressed against those who were more aggressive in claiming their viewing spots. Parents struggled to keep their children close while also trying to give them a clear view of the guards. The atmosphere remained generally positive, but there was an underlying tension that came with large crowds in confined spaces. Marcus Chun remained fixated on James, his young mind cataloging every detail of the guard's appearance and position. His parents continued to monitor his stress levels, ready to intervene if necessary, but for the moment, he seemed to be coping well. The guard's unwavering presence was providing exactly the kind of stability and predictability that helped Marcus feel safe in challenging environments. The other guards at their various positions around the palace were equally aware of the crowd's size and energy. They communicated through subtle signals and brief eye contact when their patrol routes brought them together, sharing information about potential issues or areas of concern. The responsibility of managing such large crowds while maintaining their ceremonial duties required constant vigilance and teamwork. Security personnel mingled discreetly through the crowd, their trained eyes looking for anything unusual or potentially dangerous. While the vast majority of tourists were there for innocent reasons, the guards and security staff had to remain alert for any signs of trouble. The balance between maintaining an open, welcoming atmosphere for tourists while ensuring the security of the royal residence required careful coordination between multiple agencies. The media presence was also notable that morning. Several photographers and camera crews were positioned around the palace, some covering routine ceremonial events for news outlets, others shooting footage for travel documentaries or promotional materials. Their presence added another element to the already complex environment that the guards had to navigate. James had learned to tune out the constant click of camera shutters and the whir of video cameras, but he remained aware of their presence. Guards were frequently photographed and filmed, and their images appeared in countless travel brochures, websites, and social media posts around the world. It was a responsibility he took seriously, knowing that his appearance and behavior would be seen by people far beyond those physically present at the palace. The weather was holding well, with only a few scattered clouds drifting across the autumn sky. The comfortable conditions meant that the crowd would likely continue to grow throughout the morning, reaching peak size around the time of the changing of the guard ceremony. James mentally prepared himself for the increased attention and activity that would accompany the formal ceremony. In the crowd, conversations flowed in dozens of languages as tourists shared their experiences and knowledge with family members and fellow travelers. Children asked questions about the guards' uniforms and duties, parents explained the historical significance of the ceremony, and tour guides provided context about the role of the monarchy in modern British society. The anticipation was building steadily as more and more people gathered to witness the ceremony. For many in the crowd, this would be their only opportunity to see the Queen's Guard in person, making the moment feel special and significant. The guards themselves were very much aware of this responsibility. They were not just performing their duties, but creating memories that would last a lifetime for the people watching them. As the morning progressed toward the ceremony time, none of the tourists, guards, or security personnel could have predicted that they were about to witness something that would transcend the usual boundaries of protocol and tradition. The stage was set for a moment that would remind everyone present of the humanity that exists behind even the most formal and rigid ceremonial roles. The morning had progressed smoothly until around 11 o'clock, when the careful balance that had maintained order among the crowd began to shift. A large tour group from Germany had just arrived, adding 50 more people to an already crowded viewing area. The tour guide, speaking through a loudspeaker to ensure his group could hear him over the ambient noise, began providing detailed commentary about the history of the Queen's Guard. At the same time, a group of university students had positioned themselves near the palace gates, clearly more interested in taking humorous selfies with the guards than in learning about the ceremony. Their increasingly boisterous behavior began to draw disapproving looks from other tourists, particularly the elderly visitors who had come to witness what they considered a solemn and important tradition. Marcus Chun was beginning to show more obvious signs of distress. The combination of increased noise levels, the growing density of the crowd pressing around him, and the unpredictable movements of people trying to get better viewing positions was creating exactly the kind of sensory overload that his parents had hoped to avoid. His stymieing behaviors, repetitive hand movements that helped him cope with anxiety, were becoming more pronounced, and Linda could see the telltale signs of an impending meltdown. "David," she whispered urgently to her husband, "we need to get him out of here. This is too much." But Marcus refused to move. His focus on James had intensified rather than diminished, and the guard's unchanging presence had become his lifeline in the midst of the chaos surrounding him. To leave now would mean losing the one thing that was helping him maintain his emotional equilibrium. "Please, just a few more minutes," Marcus pleaded, his voice tight with the effort of holding himself together. "I need to see the ceremony. I need to see how it happens." His parents exchanged worried glances. They knew from experience that forcing Marcus to leave when he was already struggling could trigger a complete meltdown, which would be traumatic for him and disruptive for everyone around them. But staying meant risking an even worse outcome if the crowd continued to grow and the noise levels increased further. The situation was further complicated by a group of teenage tourists who had noticed Marcus's repetitive hand movements and were beginning to point and whisper among themselves. Their behavior hadn't escalated to open mockery, but their attention was making Linda increasingly uncomfortable and protective of her son. "Look at that weird kid," one of the teenagers said, not quite quietly enough. "What's wrong with him?" Linda felt her maternal instincts flare, but before she could respond, the situation took a turn for the worse. A photographer, trying to get a better angle for his shot of the guards, pushed past the Chun family without notice, accidentally bumping into Marcus with his camera equipment. The unexpected physical contact was exactly the trigger that Marcus's overwhelmed nervous system couldn't handle. The careful control he had maintained throughout the morning shattered instantly, and he began to cry, not the typical tears of a frustrated child, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose sensory system had been pushed beyond its limits. I'm sorry," Marcus kept repeating through his tears, his small body shaking with the intensity of his emotions. "I didn't mean to. I'm sorry." The apology wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It was the learned response of a child who had been made to feel that his differences were something to be ashamed of, that his struggles were inconveniences to others. His parents immediately moved to comfort him, but the damage was done. The meltdown had begun, and once started, it would have to run its course. The reaction from the surrounding crowd was mixed and telling. Some tourists, recognizing that they were witnessing a child in distress, stepped back to give the family space and spoke in hushed, sympathetic tones. Others, less understanding or perhaps simply uncomfortable with the disruption to their planned experience, began to mutter complaints about parents who couldn't control their children in public. "This is exactly why some places don't allow children," one woman said loudly enough for the Chin family to hear. "It's ruining the whole experience for everyone else." The German tour guide, trying to maintain his group's attention and continue his presentation, raised his voice to compete with Marcus's cries, inadvertently making the acoustic environment even more overwhelming for the struggling boy. Dorothy, the elderly woman from Wales who was visiting the palace in memory of her late husband, found herself deeply moved by the scene unfolding before her. She recognized in Marcus's parents the same helpless love she had felt watching her own grandson struggle with his learning disabilities. Without hesitation, she began to make her way through the crowd toward the Chin family. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked Linda quietly, her voice full of genuine concern. "I have a grandson who sometimes gets overwhelmed in crowds too." Her kindness was like a beacon of hope in what had become an increasingly hostile environment for the Chin family. Linda looked at her gratefully, tears beginning to form in her own eyes as she struggled with the decision of whether to stay and risk Marcus's continued distress or leave and disappoint him further. Meanwhile, James had heard the commotion and, despite his training to remain focused straight ahead, was acutely aware of what was happening in the crowd nearby. The sound of Marcus's distress triggered every protective instinct he had developed during years of caring for his sister Emma. He could hear in the boy's cries the same pain and frustration that Emma had experienced during her own difficult moments in public spaces. James's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing had specifically addressed how to handle a situation where a child in the crowd was clearly suffering. Protocol demanded that he maintain his position and composure regardless of what was happening around him. The guards were expected to be unmovable, unshakable, and unresponsive to any distraction or disruption. But as Marcus's cries intensified and James heard the cruel comments from some members of the crowd, his internal conflict became almost unbearable. Every fiber of his being as a brother, as a human being, wanted to do something to help. The rigid requirements of his role felt suddenly arbitrary and heartless in the face of a child's genuine need. The other guards at their various positions around the palace were also aware of the disturbance, though none were as close to the situation as James. They had all been trained to handle disruptive tourists, but this wasn't a case of someone trying to get a reaction or cause trouble. This was clearly a child in emotional distress. Security personnel had begun to move discreetly toward the area, not because they viewed the Chun family as a threat, but because large crowd disturbances of any kind required their attention. Their presence, while professional and non-threatening, added another layer of pressure to an already difficult situation. The crowd's reaction continued to polarize. Those who understood or had experience with children who had special needs offered quiet support and understanding. Others, frustrated that their tourist experience was being disrupted, began to suggest loudly that the family should leave if they couldn't manage their child appropriately. Someone should do something, a voice called out from the crowd, though it wasn't clear whether the speaker meant that someone should help the family or remove them from the area. Marcus's meltdown was following a pattern his parents knew all too well. The initial explosion of tears and distress would eventually give way to exhaustion, but the process could take anywhere from a few minutes to over an hour, depending on the triggers and the environment. In this case, with the crowd continuing to grow and the noise levels remaining high, there was little chance of the natural de-escalation that usually helped him recover. Linda had pulled out Marcus's noise-canceling headphones and was trying to get him to wear them, but in his current state, any additional sensory input, even something designed to help, felt like an assault. He pushed the headphones away, his movements becoming more agitated as he struggled to communicate his overwhelming need for the chaos around him to stop. "Please," Linda said to no one in particular, her voice breaking with emotion. "He's not doing this on purpose. He's autistic, and crowds are really hard for him." Her explanation was meant to educate those around them, to help them understand that Marcus's behavior wasn't willful disobedience or poor parenting, but a neurological response to overwhelming stimuli. Some in the crowd received this information with increased sympathy and understanding, while others seemed to view it as an excuse rather than an explanation. The photographer who had accidentally bumped into Marcus approached the family, his face showing genuine remorse. "I'm so sorry," he said to David and Linda. "I didn't realize he was there. Is there anything I can do?" His offer was sincere, but at this point, there was little anyone could do except wait for Marcus to work through his emotional overload. The damage had been done, and the environment remained too stimulating for him to calm down quickly. James could see all of this unfolding from his peripheral vision, and with each passing moment, his internal struggle intensified. He thought of Emma, and how she looked when she was overwhelmed and frightened. He thought of all the times he had comforted her, held her until her own meltdowns passed, and protected her from people who didn't understand her differences. The sound of Marcus's distress was cutting through every defense James had built around his emotions during his years of ceremonial duty. This wasn't about protocol or tradition or military discipline. This was about a child who needed help, and James was perhaps the only person in the immediate area who might be able to provide it. But breaking his post, acknowledging the crowd, or showing any reaction to the situation would be a serious breach of protocol. It could result in disciplinary action, damage his military record, and potentially end his career with the Queen's Guard. Everything he had worked for, everything he had achieved in his 15 years of service, could be jeopardized by a single moment of human compassion. As Marcus's cries reached a new level of intensity, and the crowd's reactions became increasingly polarized, James faced a decision that would define not only his career, but his understanding of what it truly meant to serve others. The moment stretched like eternity as James stood frozen between duty and humanity. Marcus's cries had reached a heartbreaking crescendo, and the boy had begun to rock back and forth, a self-soothing behavior that his overwhelmed nervous system desperately needed. The sight reminded James so powerfully of Emma during her most difficult moments that he felt his carefully constructed professional walls beginning to crumble. The crowd's reaction had become increasingly ugly. While some tourists continued to show compassion and understanding, others had begun to actively express their displeasure with what they saw as a disruption to their carefully planned experience. "This is ridiculous," complained a man with an expensive camera. "They should take that kid somewhere else. People come here to see the ceremony, not to listen to screaming children. Some people just shouldn't bring their problem children to public events," added a woman standing nearby, her voice carrying clearly enough for the Chin family to hear. These comments hit Linda like physical blows. As a mother, she had endured years of judgmental stares and cruel remarks from people who saw Marcus's autism as a parental failing rather than a neurological condition. She had developed thick skin over the years, but hearing her son described as a problem child, while he was clearly suffering, broke something inside her. David moved protectively closer to his family, his jaw clenched with the effort of maintaining his composure. He wanted to defend his son, to educate these ignorant strangers about autism and sensory processing issues, but he knew that engaging with hostile tourists would only make the situation worse for Marcus. "We should go," Linda whispered to her husband, her voice thick with unshed tears. "This isn't working. He's getting worse, not better." But Marcus, despite his distress, seemed to understand what his mother was suggesting. Through his tears, he looked up at James, and their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. In that brief moment of connection, James saw something that shattered his resolve completely. He saw the same look Emma had given him countless times when the world became too much for her to handle. It was a look of desperate hope, a silent plea for someone, anyone, to understand and help. "No, please," Marcus managed to say between sobs. "I want to stay. I want to see the guard. He's beautiful. He's perfect. Please don't make me go." The child's words, spoken with such raw honesty and admiration even in the midst of his breakdown, hit James like a thunderbolt. Marcus saw him not as an intimidating figure or a tourist attraction, but as something beautiful and perfect. In that moment, James understood that he represented something important to this struggling child: stability, order, and predictability in a chaotic world. The internal battle that had been raging in James's mind suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity. He thought about why he had become a soldier in the first place, what it truly meant to serve and protect. Was his highest duty to maintain an inflexible adherence to protocol, or was it to embody the very best of what his uniform represented: honor, courage, and compassion? He thought about Emma and how she had taught him that the most important battles weren't always fought on foreign battlefields, but in everyday moments when someone needed kindness and understanding. He thought about all the children who had stood in front of him over the years, looking up with wonder and excitement at his tall hat and red uniform. The decision, when it came, felt surprisingly easy. James had spent 15 years being the perfect soldier, following orders without question, maintaining discipline under the most challenging circumstances. But, in this moment, being the perfect soldier meant choosing humanity over protocol. Moving slowly and deliberately, James broke his rigid posture. The change was subtle at first, a slight relaxation of his shoulders, a barely perceptible shift in his stance. But, to anyone watching closely, it was unmistakably intentional. He was choosing to acknowledge the world around him. The crowd's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Cameras began clicking furiously as tourists realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Whispers rippled through the gathered onlookers as people pointed out James's departure from the statue-like pose they expected from the Queen's Guard. Is he allowed to do that? Someone asked. I've never seen a guard move before, said another voice. But James was focused entirely on Marcus now. With movements that were careful and non-threatening, he began to lower himself toward the boy's level. The process took several long moments, each second feeling like an eternity as James knowingly violated every protocol he had been trained to follow. When he was finally crouched down, his imposing height reduced to something more accessible for a frightened child, James looked directly at Marcus. The boy's tears had slowed as he watched this impossible thing happening. The perfect, unchanging guard was moving, was looking at him, was treating him like he mattered. Hello there, James said softly, his voice barely audible above the crowd noise but clearly heard by Marcus and his family. I noticed you seem upset. Are you all right? The simple question, spoken with genuine concern and kindness, had an immediate effect on Marcus. His sobbing gradually decreased to quiet sniffles as he stared in amazement at the guard who had broken centuries of tradition just to check on him. The crowd around them had fallen into a stunned silence. Even the most vocal complainers seemed momentarily speechless at what they were witnessing. The German tour guide had stopped his commentary mid-sentence, and hundreds of cameras were now focused on the unprecedented scene unfolding before the palace gates. Marcus nodded slowly, still too overwhelmed to speak coherently, but his body language had already begun to relax. The guard's calm presence and gentle voice were providing exactly what his overstimulated nervous system needed, a focal point of stability and safety. I like your uniform, Marcus managed to whisper. It's just like in the pictures. Everything is exactly right. James smiled, actually smiled, breaking another fundamental rule of his role as a ceremonial guard. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you to say. I work very hard to make sure everything is just right. The conversation, quiet and personal despite taking place in front of hundreds of witnesses, continued for several more moments. James asked Marcus about his trip to London, complimented him on his knowledge about the Queen's Guard, and spoke to him with the same respect he would show any visitor to the palace. David and Linda Chen watched in amazement as their son's meltdown transformed into engaged conversation. They had witnessed countless interactions between Marcus and adults over the years, but none had shown the intuitive understanding and genuine respect that this guard was demonstrating. I have a sister who sometimes gets overwhelmed in crowds too, James told Marcus, speaking loud enough for his parents to hear as well. Sometimes the world can be a lot to handle, can't it? But you're being very brave. The validation and understanding in his words had a profound effect on the entire Chen family. Linda felt tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of gratitude rather than frustration. Someone had seen her son struggle not as a behavioral problem, but as a legitimate challenge deserving of compassion and support. Other tourists in the immediate area had also been moved by what they were witnessing. Dorothy, the elderly woman from Wales, was openly crying as she watched the scene unfold. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, she whispered to her daughter. The teenagers who had earlier made unkind comments about Marcus were notably silent now, perhaps recognizing the dignity and respect that the guard was showing to someone they had dismissed as weird. The photographer who had accidentally triggered the situation was capturing the entire interaction, but his motives had shifted completely. What had started as routine documentation of a tourist attraction had become something far more significant. The recording of a moment of pure human kindness that transcended all the barriers and expectations that normally separated people. Security personnel had also arrived at the scene, but rather than intervening to restore protocol, they stood back and observed. Even they seemed to recognize that what was happening was more important than adherence to standard procedures. James's commanding officers, monitoring the situation from their positions around the palace, faced their own difficult decisions. By any strict interpretation of regulations, James's behavior was a serious breach of protocol that required immediate correction. But the circumstances were so extraordinary, and his actions so clearly motivated by compassion rather than defiance, that they chose to allow the situation to continue. As Marcus's emotional state continued to stabilize, James began to prepare for the difficult transition back to his official duties. He explained to Marcus that he needed to return to his position, but assured the boy that he would be watching and that Marcus was welcome to stay and observe the ceremony. Will you be standing very still again? Marcus asked. Yes, I will, James replied. That's my job. But I want you to know that even when I'm standing still, I'm still thinking about nice things, like meeting you today. The promise seemed to satisfy Marcus completely. He had received the acknowledgement and respect he needed, and now he could return to his fascination with the ceremony, knowing that the guard was not just a statue, but a real person who had chosen to care about him. As James slowly returned to his full height and began to resume his ceremonial posture, the crowd around them erupted in spontaneous applause. The sound started with just a few people clapping, but quickly spread until hundreds of tourists were showing their appreciation for what they had just witnessed. Marcus clapped too, his face now bright with joy instead of tears. The meltdown was over, replaced by a sense of wonder and connection that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had not only seen the Queen's Guard ceremony he had dreamed about, but had experienced something far more valuable, a moment of pure human kindness that showed him he was worthy of respect and understanding. The applause that had erupted from the crowd continued for several minutes, creating an atmosphere unlike anything ever experienced at Buckingham Palace. Tourists who had traveled thousands of miles expecting to see a traditional ceremony were instead witnessing something far more profound, a spontaneous celebration of human kindness that transcended cultural boundaries and language barriers. Marcus stood beside his parents, his face glowing with happiness as he watched James resume his ceremonial position. The transformation in the boy was remarkable. Where minutes earlier he had been overwhelmed by sensory overload and emotional distress, he now stood calmly, his attention focused entirely on the guard who had shown him such unexpected compassion. "Look, Mom," Marcus whispered excitedly, pointing at James. "He's doing his job again. But now I know he's really a person inside. He likes me." Linda wiped away tears that continued to flow, but these were tears of joy and relief. In 10 years of navigating public spaces with Marcus, she had never witnessed such understanding and kindness from a stranger. The guard had not only helped her son through a crisis, but had done so with a dignity and respect that honored Marcus's worth as a human being. The crowd dynamic had completely shifted. The hostile voices that had earlier complained about Marcus's presence had been silenced, replaced by expressions of awe and admiration for what they had witnessed. Many tourists were now approaching the Chun family with words of support and encouragement. "Your son is wonderful," Dorothy from Wales told Linda, her eyes still moist with emotion. "What that guard did was beautiful. Harold would have loved to see this." She paused, thinking of her late husband. "This is exactly why we dreamed of coming here, to see the best of humanity." The German tour guide, who had moments earlier been competing with Marcus's cries for his group's attention, now gathered his tourists around him to explain what they had just witnessed. "This," he told them in accented English, "is something you will never see in any guidebook. This is why travel is about more than just seeing famous places. It's about witnessing moments of genuine human connection." Word of the incident was already spreading beyond the immediate crowd. Several tourists had captured the interaction on their phones and were sharing videos on social media. Within hours, the footage would begin appearing on news websites and viral video platforms around the world, each share carrying the message that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when people choose compassion over convention. The photographer who had accidentally triggered the situation approached David and Linda with a different request than anyone might have expected. "I have pictures of the whole thing," he told them. "The moment your son met the guard, everything that happened. Would you like copies? I think this is something your family should have to remember." His offer was made with sincerity and respect, recognizing that he had documented something precious rather than merely newsworthy. The photographs would later become treasured family memories, capturing not just Marcus's meeting with James, but the broader moment when an entire crowd chose empathy over judgment. James, now back in his official position, continued to perform his duties with the same precision and professionalism he had always maintained. But something fundamental had changed. The rigid barrier between his personal values and professional role had been permanently altered. He had discovered that true strength sometimes meant being flexible, that real discipline included knowing when rules should serve humanity rather than the other way around. His fellow guards had observed the entire situation, and while none spoke while on duty, their expressions showed admiration rather than disapproval. They had all joined the Queen's Guard to serve and protect, and what James had done embodied the highest ideals of service, putting the needs of others before personal consideration of consequences. The commanding officers faced a complex situation. By the strictest interpretation of regulations, James had committed a serious breach of protocol. But the circumstances were so extraordinary, and the outcome so positive, that traditional disciplinary measures seemed not only inappropriate, but potentially damaging to the reputation of the entire unit. Major Richardson, the senior officer responsible for ceremonial duties, made a decision that would set a precedent for future situations. Rather than treating James's actions as a disciplinary matter, he chose to recognize them as an example of the values that the Queen's Guard was meant to represent: service, honor, and protection of those who needed it most. What Sergeant Mitchell did today, Richardson would later write in his official report, demonstrated the highest traditions of British military service. He saw a child in distress and responded with the courage and compassion that defined the very best of our soldiers. While adherence to protocol is important, our ultimate duty is to embody the values that make our institution worthy of public trust and respect. The changing of the guard ceremony proceeded as scheduled, but it took place in an atmosphere charged with emotion and significance. The tourists who had witnessed James's interaction with Marcus viewed the entire proceedings differently, seeing past the pageantry to recognize the human beings who made the tradition possible. Marcus watched the ceremony with rapt attention, but his focus had evolved from simple fascination with military precision to a deeper appreciation for the people behind the uniforms. He understood now that the guards weren't just living statues performing for tourists. They were individuals who had chosen to serve something larger than themselves. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, the Chen family found themselves surrounded by well-wishers from around the world. Tourists from Germany, Japan, Australia, and dozens of other countries approached them to express their admiration for how they had handled the situation and their gratitude for allowing them to witness such a powerful moment. "Your son taught us all something important today," said an elderly man from Japan, speaking through his daughter, who served as translator. "He showed us that differences should be celebrated, not hidden." A young woman from Australia took a different approach, addressing Marcus directly. "You're amazing," she told him. "I work with kids with autism back home, and I'm going to tell them about you and the guard who became your friend." These interactions were helping Marcus understand that his experience had meaning beyond his own family. He was beginning to see himself not as someone who had caused a scene, but as someone who had been part of something important and beautiful. The media attention continued to grow throughout the day and into the following weeks. News outlets around the world picked up the story, but the coverage was notably different from typical viral video reporting. Rather than sensationalizing the incident or focusing on the protocol breach, most media emphasized the human values demonstrated by both James and the crowd's response. The story resonated particularly strongly with families who had children with autism or other special needs. Parents wrote letters to the palace sharing their own struggles with public acceptance and expressing gratitude for the visibility that the incident had brought to their experiences. Schools began using the story as a teaching tool for discussions about empathy, inclusion, and the courage required to do the right thing even when it's not easy. The image of a highly trained soldier choosing to kneel down to comfort a distressed child became a powerful symbol for educators worldwide. James himself was initially concerned about the attention and its potential impact on his career. But as letters and emails poured in from around the world, he began to understand the broader significance of his actions. Military families wrote to thank him for showing that soldiers could be both strong and compassionate. Parents of children with disabilities expressed gratitude for the respect and dignity he had shown their community. One letter particularly moved him, from a teenage boy with autism who had struggled with feeling different and unwanted in public spaces. "When I saw the video of you helping that boy," the teenager wrote, "it made me feel like maybe I'm not so weird after all. Maybe there are people who will understand and help me too." The incident also prompted discussions within the military about the balance between protocol and compassion. Training programs began incorporating scenarios that challenged guards to think about the human impact of their actions while maintaining the discipline and professionalism required for their roles. 6 months after the incident, Marcus and his family returned to London for another visit. They had specifically requested permission to meet James again, and the palace had arranged for a private meeting during his off-duty hours. The reunion was emotional for both the guard and the boy, who had maintained a correspondence through letters and emails. "You changed my life," Marcus told James during their meeting. "You showed me that I matter, even when I'm different. And you taught everyone watching that being kind is more important than following rules that don't help anybody." James was struck by the wisdom in the boy's words and the maturity he had gained in the months since their first meeting. "You changed my life too," he replied. "You reminded me why I became a soldier in the first place, to protect and serve people, especially those who need it most. The story of the Royal Guard and the autistic boy continued to be shared and referenced years later, becoming a touchstone for discussions about inclusion, empathy, and the power of individual actions to create positive change. It demonstrated that sometimes the most profound moments of service happen not in grand gestures or official ceremonies, but in quiet acts of kindness between strangers who choose to see each other's humanity. For Marcus, the experience became a defining moment that shaped his understanding of his place in the world. He learned that being different didn't make him less valuable, and that there were people willing to stand up for those who needed support. As he grew older, he would often reference that day as the moment he realized he could contribute something meaningful to the world, differences and all. For James, the incident marked an evolution in his understanding of what it truly meant to serve. He continued his career with the Queen's Guard, but with a deeper appreciation for the human connections that gave meaning to tradition and protocol. He never regretted his choice to break ranks that day, knowing that he had honored the highest ideals of military service by choosing compassion when it mattered most. The lasting impact of that October morning extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. It became a reminder that in an increasingly divided and polarized world, moments of genuine human connection still have the power to unite people across all differences of culture, language, and background. Sometimes, the most important revolutions begin with a single act of kindness that reminds everyone watching what it truly means to be human.